pilots of an Air Canada DC-9 are in a race against the clock. A fire has taken hold on board, and with each passing second, the smoke thickens and the pilots lose critical instruments. Passengers cough and choke on the toxic fumes, desperate to escape the burning plane. Will the pilots manage to land their stricken jet before it's too late, or will the fire consume their chances? This is the story of Air Canada Flight 797. Thanks to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. On the afternoon of June 2nd, 1983, 41 passengers and 5 crew boarded a McDonnell Douglas DC-9 in Dallas, Texas. They were bound for Montreal, in Canada, with a stopover in Toronto. The first leg of the route to Toronto was expected to take about 3 hours. Even back in 1983, more than 40 years ago, the DC-9 was an aging aircraft. By that point, its design was almost 20 years old, and McDonnell Douglas had just stopped producing new ones the previous year. The aircraft was still in widespread use, however, and had proven itself as a workhorse for airlines around the world, with almost 1,000 being produced. This particular airframe had been in service for 15 years, and had been with Air Canada for all of that time, operating many of the airline's short-haul routes. But it had a rather checkered past. 3 years previously, as the airplane levelled off at its cruising altitude after departing Boston, the aft pressure bulkhead, the domed structure which keeps the plane a sealed container, cracked, causing an explosive decompression. As the air inside the cabin rushed out the back of the plane, it and the debris it carried caused extensive damage, destroying flight control components and other critical aircraft parts. The damage was so severe that it took months to repair, with the airline replacing both rear lavatories as well as splicing and rearranging bundles of electrical wiring. Whether it was a direct result of these repairs or something else entirely, a different kind of problem would befall Flight 797 on this day. One which was far more insidious and far more deadly. The passengers knew nothing about this troubled history as they took their seats and settled in for departure. For the pilots, however, it was a different story. The captain of this flight was 51-year-old Donald Cameron. Cameron had an immense amount of flying experience, having racked up 13,000 hours, almost 5,000 of which were on the DC-9. He had been with Air Canada for 17 years at this point. To his right was 34-year-old First Officer Claude Ouimet. He had joined Air Canada 10 years previously, and had accumulated 5,500 flying hours, about half of which were on the DC-9. By all appearances, the passengers could not have been in safer hands. Both pilots knew that this aircraft had had its fair share of issues, with multiple components exhibiting repeated failures. In the past year, the tech log had documented 76 entries concerning the aircraft's 2 engine-driven generators and the auxiliary power unit generator. Not the clean bill of health that a pilot or passenger would want, ideally, but at least for this flight, things appeared to be working normally. At just after 4 o'clock that afternoon, once the aircraft was loaded and ready to go, Flight 797 was pushed back from its gate at Dallas-Fort Worth. The pilots started the plane's 2 engines and began their taxi out to the active runway. In about 3 hours, they were expecting to arrive in Toronto. At 25 minutes past 4, Flight 797 lifted off and climbed out into the warm Texan summer sky. Thunderstorms were bubbling up from the vast plains below, and the pilots dodged these as they climbed. Eventually, they reached their cruising altitude of flight level 330, about 33,000 feet, far above the weather. It would be sunny skies all the way until they started their descent into Toronto. About an hour and 20 minutes after takeoff, as the plane soared above Louisville, Kentucky, the flight attendants were going through the cabin serving food and drinks. Up front, the atmosphere was relaxed, as First Officer Ouimet tucked into his meal of steak and some seafood, the former of which was a bit dry, he said. But as they chatted between themselves, the pilots were interrupted by a succession of clicking sounds. They looked at the circuit breaker panel behind the captain, trying to locate a potential source. The captain saw that 3 circuit breakers had popped, and that these were related to the flushing of one of the plane's toilets. The purpose of circuit breakers is to cut the electrical supply to a piece of equipment to prevent it from getting too hot and potentially catching fire. The pilots didn't know why the breakers had popped, and the captain decided, functioning toilets being an important part of the passenger experience after all, that it would be worth trying to restore the flushing function. He pressed in the 3 circuit breakers, one after the other. But so assuredly had they popped, that they didn't even click into place when he pushed them back in. They simply moved in and out with his finger. The captain likened the sound of the popping to a machine gun. Captain Cameron took out the plane's tech log and began adding yet another problem to the plane's growing litany. The pilots concluded that one of the passengers must have pushed a rag down the toilet, jamming it and causing the flushing motor to overheat, triggering the circuit breakers to trip as a protective measure. This was a reasonable guess as to what had happened, and both pilots had experienced similar issues before. But about 90 feet behind the pilots, on the other side of the panelling in the aft left bathroom, trouble was brewing. The electrical problems they had innocently explained away as being a result of a jammed flushing motor, in fact, had a much more sinister cause. Soon, this would become impossible to ignore. Air traffic control passed the flight onto Indianapolis Center Control, and the pilots made contact. They were at flight level 330, and they were heading direct to the Louisville radio beacon. For the next few minutes, the flight progressed as normal. The pilots discussed the weather they could see out their windows, commenting about how they couldn't see much of the ground due to the clouds. Captain Cameron tried to find the correct reference codes to write into the tech log for the circuit breakers. Far behind him, out of sight of anybody on board, the problem continued to get worse. Thanks to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, and is now available on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and mobile. What I like about War Thunder is the sheer variety. You can play as over 2,500 planes, tanks, helicopters, and ships in massive online battles with over 70 million other players. There's everything from the armoured cars of the 1920s to the fighter jets and battle tanks of today, which means there's always a new way to experience the game. What makes War Thunder especially fun for me is that unlike a lot of other games, you don't have just a single hit point score. Every vehicle is intricately modelled down to its individual components, like engines, fuel tanks, weapons, and crew, all of which can take damage from enemy fire. This means that no two games are the same. You can really bring your own style to the battles too. There are countless camouflages, historical markings, and decorations for all types of vehicles, including some created by the community itself. You don't need a supercomputer to play War Thunder on PC either. A mouse and a keyboard will do. Play War Thunder for free using my links in the pinned comment and video description. It's available on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and mobile. Make sure you use my links below, because with them, you'll get a massive free bonus pack if you're a new player, or if you haven't played in 6 months on PC or consoles. As part of this bonus pack, you get 3 premium vehicles and an exclusive vehicle decorator, Eagle of Valor, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of premium account. This is available for limited time only, so get it while you still can. Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to Flight 797. 9 minutes after the circuit breakers had popped, the pilots decided to try pushing them in again. The captain pushed each of the 3 circuit breakers in, but just as before, they immediately popped out. Clearly, whatever had caused the breakers to pop wasn't going away. As far as the pilots were concerned, this was just going to be an inconvenience more than anything. The aft bathroom would simply be unusable for the rest of the flight. Resigned to the feeling that the issue was as fixed as it could be, the captain then asked the cabin crew if he could be served his own dinner now, and he handed over control to the first officer. At this moment, the aircraft was just beginning a left-hand turn from the Louisville radio beacon towards Rosewood, just to the north of Dayton, Ohio. As this was happening, something of a commotion was breaking out in the back of the passenger cabin. One of the passengers sitting near the rear of the aircraft had alerted one of the cabin crew to an unusual burning electrical smell. Other passengers had noticed this smell too. The flight attendant suspected the smoke was originating from the aft lavatory, and cautiously opened the lavatory door just a crack. Her eyes met a scene of light grey smoke, thick from floor to ceiling. However, no flames were visible. She asked a nearby colleague to tell the senior cabin crew member, which she did, saying that there was a fire in the rear lavatory. The senior cabin crew member then told another one of the crew to tell the captain, while he, the senior cabin crew member, went back to put the fire out. He grabbed a CO2 fire extinguisher, opened the door, and saturated the bathroom with CO2. He paid particular attention to the seams between the wall and the ceiling, where the smoke was emerging from, and to the door of the waste bin, before closing the lavatory door. Importantly, he hadn't seen any flames, and he could tell that the smoke was in fact coming from behind the wall panelling. This didn't appear to be a washbin fire, the kind most commonly caused when a passenger puts a cigarette butt in the bathroom's rubbish bin. Despite knowing that the fire was behind the panelling though, he had not been trained on which lavatory panels could be removed or destroyed without endangering critical airplane components. This made him hesitant to use the crash axe to hack down the panelling required to get at the fire itself. All he felt he could do was use as much of the extinguisher as he could, and then close the door to prevent more smoke from getting into the passenger cabin. So, the bathroom was now full of carbon dioxide, but the source of the fire, somewhere behind the bathroom panelling, remained untouched. As a precaution, the cabin crew went about moving the passengers up towards the front of the aircraft and opening the air vents above the seats in an attempt to push the air towards the rear of the plane. For the pilots, the first real sign of trouble came when one of the cabin crew reached the cockpit and told them that there was a fire in the rear bathroom, and that one of their colleagues had gone to extinguish it. An in-flight fire is the worst possible emergency on an aircraft. The accident history shows that once pilots become aware of a fire, they have, on average, 17 minutes to land before the plane becomes uncontrollable. It was now 11.5 minutes since the circuit breakers had tripped. If there was a fire, the pilots didn't have long to get their plane on the ground. However, in 1983, fires were not an exceedingly rare occurrence, as passengers were known to put their unfinished cigarettes in the wash bins. These bins were lined with fireproof material, and, in any case, cabin crew were trained to put these fires out. But here was a key omission in the flow of information between the cabin crew and the pilots. The cabin crew hadn't mentioned what the source of the fire was, only that there was a fire. Naturally, the pilots assumed that this was yet another washbin fire, likely a result of a discarded cigarette. So, to confirm this suspicion, the captain sent the first officer back to investigate. As the first officer departed the cockpit, the captain put on his oxygen mask. This being 1983, the aircraft was not equipped with, nor was it required to be equipped with, self-contained breathing equipment, or a full-face smoke mask. So, First Officer Ouimet had to do without these, as he made his way towards the smoky rear cabin. Unsurprisingly, without this equipment, Ouimet was unable to even reach the aft lavatory, due to the thick smoke that had now spread over the last 3 to 4 rows of seats. However, while his mission itself was not a success, he did get some new information while back there. The chief cabin crew member explained that he hadn't seen the source of the fire while trying to extinguish it, and that it didn't seem to be coming from the rubbish bin. This changed the situation entirely. A washbin fire which can be seen and extinguished is one thing, but a fire which can't be seen cannot be extinguished. The first officer made his way back to the cockpit, determined to go back again, this time with some smoke goggles, so that he could at least find out where the smoke was coming from. Upon his return to the cockpit, the first officer told the captain that the smoke was so dense he couldn't even reach the bathroom to investigate. He suggested that they start descending immediately. However, the first officer left out one key piece of information: the flight attendant's report that the fire appeared not to be in the wash basin. The omission of this information meant that the captain was still free to conclude that what he was dealing with was quite possibly just a very smoky washbin fire, probably from a cigarette. But before the captain even got a chance to take his thinking further, perhaps while descending, the senior cabin crew member appeared in the cockpit. He told the pilots that the passengers had been moved forwards and that the smoke appeared to be easing up. The first officer glanced back and saw that the back of the plane was indeed almost clear of smoke now. Captain Cameron had a lot of information to assimilate here, much of it contradictory. On one hand, there had been a lot of smoke, so much that the first officer hadn't even been able to get to the bathroom to find its source. This suggested the presence of an uncontrollable blaze. On the other hand though, the smoke appeared to be clearing now. That is not typical behaviour for an uncontrollable blaze. The cabin crew had reported that there was a fire, and that they had used a fire extinguisher to try putting it out. That, combined with the fact that the smoke was now clearing, lent further credence to the idea that this was just a typical washbin fire. Again, not disastrous inferno territory. But then, what about the circuit breakers? Had the flushing motor just happened to seize at the same time that there was a fire in the rubbish bin? Or might the popping of the circuit breakers be related to the fire in some way? What if the actual origin of the fire was in fact out of sight in the electrical wiring behind or underneath the bathroom? Cameron had decades of flying experience. He knew that by far the most common cause of fires on passenger aircraft was cigarettes in the wash bin, not anything more sinister. To borrow an adage from the medical world, when you hear hooves, think horses, not zebras. But misdiagnosis is a costly mistake, all the more so in aviation. The safest option at this point would be to begin diverting to a nearby airport. But humans don't naturally evaluate information in a fully objective, probabilistic way. Rather, we have our suspicions and biases, and we give more weighting to the evidence which supports the conclusion we already favour. In psychology, this is known as confirmation bias. Faced with contradictory evidence, the captain leaned towards believing that the smoke was a result of a washbin fire, which was now dying out. Just to be sure though, he sent the first officer to the back again, this time urging him not to get incapacitated in the process. Ouimet's smoke goggles were inaccessible once he'd gotten out of his seat, so Cameron gave him his own before he headed back. The aircraft remained in the cruise at flight level 330. As the first officer neared the aft lavatory, the lead cabin crew member again told the captain that the smoke was dissipating, further confirming his suspicion that there had been a washbin fire which had been successfully put out. It was true that the smoke in the cabin had thinned out, quite a bit actually. The passengers had resumed chatting as normal and ordering drinks. But what the captain didn't know, and what nobody on board knew, was that the clearing of the smoke was not a result of the fire weakening, but actually of it getting stronger. That's because, as the fire became more intense, it burned through the bathroom piping and ventilation lines, providing a new avenue through which smoke could escape. This lulled everyone on board into a false sense of security, at a time when the fire was in fact more intense than ever. But, on the basis of the reports from the co-pilot and cabin crew, the captain decided not to begin the descent towards an alternate airport. It was now 15 minutes since the circuit breakers had popped. When First Officer Ouimet arrived at the rear lavatory, he put on his smoke goggles and reached for the door handle. However, immediately upon touching the handle, he found that it was hot. Clearly, the fire had not been extinguished. Ouimet kept the door closed and told the cabin crew not to open it again. At that very moment, up in the cockpit, the reality of the situation had just become unignorable. The master caution light illuminated, indicating that the electrical systems of the airplane's left side had failed. The immediate result was that electrical components throughout the aircraft began to fail. Crucially, this included important instruments in the cockpit, like its heading indicators. Confused, the captain didn't assimilate the true implications of these failures, that there was a serious fire on board, and that it was now burning through the plane's electrical wiring. Instead of declaring a mayday and beginning an immediate descent, he told air traffic control that the plane had an electrical problem, and asked them to stand by for further information. The captain did have his reasons for thinking that the plane was experiencing mere electrical anomalies. This aircraft had had repeated electrical issues over the previous year, the write-ups for which he had seen in the plane's tech log at the outset of this very flight. But in light of the reports of smoke and fire, these new failures should have taken on a different meaning. What Flight 797 was experiencing was no ordinary electrical problem. And as the fire grew even bigger, it began burning through more of the aircraft's vital equipment. Next to go was the wiring which fed electricity to the plane's transponder, the unit that tells air traffic control where the plane is. So, 45 seconds after Captain Cameron had told air traffic control to stand by, the flight disappeared from radar. Thankfully, the controller was able to switch to an old-fashioned backup system, primary radar, which simply works on the basis of reflectance. Once he did this, he was able to see Flight 797 again, but he could only see where it was, not its altitude or any more detailed information. Up until this point, the situation on board had been calm, and the pilots had been in control. But from this moment onwards, with every passing minute, the flight's problems would get exponentially worse. As this was happening in the cockpit, the first officer noticed a cabin crew member gesturing for him to return to the cockpit quickly. The first officer rushed back, took his seat, and told the captain that he thought they needed to descend immediately. The captain knew from his tone that the situation was far more serious than he had thought it was. As if to back this up, the master warning light then flashed, this time accompanied by annunciator lights indicating a loss of power to both of the emergency electrical buses. Now, the most important instruments in the cockpit, the two pilots' attitude indicators, began to fail. The captain told the first officer to activate the emergency power switch, which directed battery power to these instruments, allowing them to come to life again. But the plane now only had enough electrical power to supply a small number of systems. In fact, without AC power, the horizontal stabilizer at the back of the plane had stopped working. Without it, all the captain now had to control the pitch of the aircraft was the elevators, the much smaller surfaces attached to the rear of the stabilizer. This meant that when he needed to point the plane up or down, he would have to exert huge amounts of force on his control column. What had started out as an exercise in problem solving and decision making had now become a test of physical stamina too. This was the stuff of nightmares, an uncontained fire on board with multiple instrument failures. For the first time since the flight began, it became clear the stakes were life and death. The captain quickly brought the throttles back to idle, pulled the speed brake handle, and began pitching the plane down into a steep descent. As he did this, Cameron declared an emergency to air traffic control, telling them that they had a fire on board and that they were descending. The controller told him that he had him on radar at 25 nautical miles from the Cincinnati airport and asked if he could make it there. 25 miles was very close. Normally, a plane requires about 100 miles to lose 33,000 feet of altitude. But this was no ordinary situation. The captain said that he could make Cincinnati, and then requested descent clearance. The controller cleared Flight 797 down to 5,000 feet. As the aircraft plunged into a thick layer of clouds at 25,000 feet, the atmosphere on board became increasingly toxic. With the fire raging behind the plastic fittings, acrid fumes began to enter the cabin not just from the toilet area, but from the seams in the fuselage ceiling and the overhead bins. Passengers began conserving their breath, taking small sips of air to avoid coughing and choking on the poisonous air. The smoke was filling the cabin like a sandglass in reverse, with smoke building up at the ceiling and then getting lower and lower as the minutes ticked on. This was a far cry from the calm on board just minutes ago. The passengers were desperate for air, but the captain refused to drop the oxygen masks. Doing this might not only make the fire worse, but it wouldn't help the passengers anyway, as passenger oxygen masks don't form a complete seal, meaning that the full breaths the passengers would take while wearing them would draw in smoke too, only harming their lungs further. They had no choice but to hold on for dear life as the pilots brought the plane down. The captain was tearing through the clouds at lightning speed. He had pulled the speed brake handle all the way back, to the position it was only supposed to be at on the ground. But rather than extending fully into the airflow, the spoilers were forced back to their normal in-flight position by the sheer power of the oncoming air. The aircraft was travelling at an indicated airspeed of 310 knots, close to its overspeed limit. So quickly was it losing altitude that the instrument which measures this, the vertical speed indicator, had its needle pegged against the limit, showing that the plane was losing at least 6,000 feet per minute. This was a race against the clock, and still engulfed in dense clouds, the pilots were hoping that they would be able to see the ground by the time they needed to land. As the smoke worsened, the cabin crew decided that they had better tell the passengers what to expect and what to do once they got on the ground. But now joining the list of failed equipment was the PA system. Neither the pilots nor the cabin crew had the ability to communicate with the passengers as a group anymore. So the cabin crew began making their way through the cabin, instructing the passengers sitting near the emergency exits on how and when to open them. Up in the cockpit, more problems began popping up, and this time they came from air traffic control. Because the controllers had to revert to ancient primary radar to see Flight 797, all the planes on their screens were simply indicated by plus signs without the usual identity information. This meant that when the Indianapolis Center Controller handed Flight 797 off to the approach controller at Cincinnati, the approach controller picked the wrong target on his screen to label as Flight 797. This is important because, given that flight's position and heading, it made sense to set it up for a landing on runway 36, Cincinnati's northern runway. He also told the tower controller at Cincinnati to get the fire trucks ready for an emergency aircraft landing on runway 36. For these few minutes as they talked to the controller, the pilots had no idea that he thought they were a completely different aircraft. This confusion continued as the aircraft ascended eastbound towards Cincinnati. Unbeknownst to the captain, who was busy flying the aircraft, the first officer had left the cockpit door open. His reason for this was to make it easier to communicate with the cabin crew. But now, this decision was coming back to bite them. Smoke had now begun billowing into the cockpit. Unlike passenger oxygen masks, which are only designed to be used in a decompression, pilot oxygen masks form a tight seal, and they can be set up so as to prevent any ambient air and smoke from entering. It was a good thing that the pilots had donned theirs, but that didn't mean they were out of the woods as far as smoke was concerned. As more and more began pouring into the cramped space of the cockpit, it became increasingly difficult for the pilots to see their instruments. They now had to squint and hold their checklists up to their faces to read them. The workload for both pilots was immense. Not only did they have to set up their aircraft for an instrument approach into an airport they had not planned on landing at, completing all of the normal checklists for this, but they also had to run through emergency checklists and procedures, while communicating through oxygen masks, which made it harder to hear each other, and while their cramped office was filling with smoke. And they had to do all of this in a fraction of the time they would normally have to prepare for a landing. If they took too long, the fire would render their aircraft uncontrollable, spelling certain death. This situation would have been extremely challenging even if everything in the cockpit was working right. But as Flight 797 descended through 8,000 feet, the emergency inverter, which the first officer had switched on minutes ago, stopped working. Both pilots' attitude direction indicators failed, along with their compasses and navigation instruments. These are some of the most basic flying instruments. To lose them while flying through thick clouds is a pilot's nightmare. Now, Captain Cameron was flying almost blind. The only instruments he could rely on as he peered through the dense smoke to see them were the tiny backup attitude indicator to tell him whether he was pointing up or down or banking left or right, his altimeter to tell him his altitude, and his airspeed indicator. This hellish situation seemed almost unrecoverable. At this point, the controller finally realized that he had mistaken Flight 797 for another aircraft, Continental Airlines Flight 383. But there was a big problem. Flight 797 was at an altitude of 8,000 feet, and yet it was just 8 miles to the south of runway 36 at Cincinnati. This was way too close to lose all of that altitude in time for landing. The controller would need to vector the flight around for a different runway. And so he decided on runway 27 left, the airport's main westerly runway. Just to be sure that the target on his scope was indeed Flight 797, he asked the captain to turn to the left. Cameron did this, and the controller was able to identify the plane for certain. The lack of a functioning compass was another debilitating failure on board the stricken flight. Without a compass, the pilots would not be able to take heading instructions from air traffic control to guide them to the airport. The controller would have to simply say turn left or turn right, and then, when he wanted them to straighten out, stop turn. The pilots had little idea where they were in relation to the airport. They simply had to place their trust in the controller and in his ability to give them efficient instructions all the way to runway 27 left. Behind the pilots, the cabin crew were distributing wet towels to the passengers for them to breathe through. This was not part of their training, but it helped filter out toxic smoke and gases. They had moved all of the passengers to the front of the aircraft, away from the source of the fire. But by now, nowhere on board was safe. The first officer instructed the cabin crew to sit down. With the plane now reaching 3,500 feet, it would either be landing very soon or not at all. 5 minutes after starting his hair-raising dive, Captain Cameron had finally got the plane down to 3,500 feet. But still, it was cloudy. The pilots would need to descend further. The controller cleared Flight 797 down to 2,500 feet and directed them northwest towards the airport. Still, the plane was travelling fast. Every second counted, and Captain Cameron was willing to keep his speed high now, even if it made slowing down more difficult close to the airport. He had to draw on his experience to balance all of the risks that he faced, trying to do whatever it took to get the plane on the ground quickly and safely. Part of this involved not just thinking about how to handle the aircraft right at that moment, but about what kind of situation would meet him on the ground if he did manage to land. He knew that given the speed of the plane's descent, the cabin would likely still be pressurized when he landed. If this was the case, the cabin crew would not be able to open the doors and evacuate the aircraft. So he told the first officer to depressurize the plane, which he did. The outflow valves on the plane's fuselage opened, and some of the toxic cabin air now left the aircraft. But at 3,000 feet, there wasn't that much of a difference in air pressure between inside and outside the cabin, so the smoke continued to build. Without telling the captain, the first officer turned the air conditioning packs off. This would prove to be a highly consequential decision. These packs bring in fresh air to the cabin, and the first officer had reasoned that turning them off would starve the fire of oxygen, buying the crew precious minutes to get the plane on the ground. He also figured that given how bad the smoke was, it could hardly get any worse. Ouimet felt that he had to try something to reduce the amount of smoke on board. But unbeknownst to him, when he shut off the air conditioning packs, he had eliminated the best available means of getting rid of smoke from the cockpit and cabin. Now, there was virtually no fresh air coming in. The plane was almost a sealed container, and the fire inside it continued to grow and to generate toxic gases and smoke. The cabin now began to heat up even faster, and crucially, combustible gases began to accumulate near the ceiling. At long last, as they descended through 3,000 feet, the plane broke out of the clouds. Finally, the pilots could see the ground. But the airport, 12 miles away, according to the controller, was nowhere to be seen. And given the amount of smoke in the cockpit, the pilots wouldn't be seeing it until they were very close. As Flight 797 continued its approach, the controller told the fire services to be ready at 27 left, rather than the previously planned 36. He asked the flight crew for their aircraft type, number of people on board, and amount of fuel. This information would help the fire services when they reached the aircraft. But the first officer told the controller that he did not have time to get this information. Every second had to be dedicated to what had now become the only important thing: landing the plane. The pilots were leaning forward in their seats, trying to read their instruments through the smoke. In the heat, the captain's perspiration was causing his smoke goggles to fog up, making it even more difficult for him to see. As he flew with one hand, he had to take these goggles off with the other, clean them while the smoke stung his eyes, and then put them back on. The loss of stabilizer trim made the controls incredibly heavy, and as the pilots configured the aircraft for landing, lowering the flaps and slowing down, Cameron was struggling with the sheer physical forces required on the controls. To give the pilots the best chance of seeing the runway, the controller turned the runway lights up to maximum intensity. But still, they couldn't see it. Then, finally, with just 2 miles to go, the runway came into view. the captain dropped the gear and extended the flaps further. He knew that he would only have one attempt at landing. Without functioning engine instruments, Cameron had to fly the aircraft fully based on feel, which itself was hard to do given how heavy the controls had now become. He knew that as long as he put the throttle levers at a setting that gave him a normal approach speed of 140 knots, he would be able to land. In the back, the passengers were coughing and choking. The air in the cabin was hot, dense, and filled with smoke. It was a sickening feeling, hearing the engines spool up and down as the captain adjusted the throttles and manoeuvred the plane to keep it coming down towards the runway. It was now so smoky inside the cabin that the cabin crew were not even able to look outside to estimate how long the plane had until landing. The first officer got the evacuation checklists ready. As soon as the plane stopped, they would get everybody off. In a desperate bid to clear the smoke, the first officer opened the side window. Howling wind blasted through the cockpit at over 250 km per hour, unleashing chaos and making it impossible for the pilots to hear anything. Ouimet closed the window almost immediately. However distracting this had been, it did clear some of the smoke, and Ouimet opened the window a few more times in order to give the captain the best chance of seeing the runway. The tower controllers could see the stricken plane on its way in, now just a few hundred feet above the ground. Any second, it would be touching down. From this vantage point, they could see none of the chaos on board. But this wouldn't last long. As the captain neared the runway, another problem came into view. How would the aircraft behave once it landed? Would it go off the side of the runway? What if the brake lines and thrust reversers were affected too? Would it even be able to stop on the runway? The cabin crew had gone through the aisle, briefing the passengers on how to adopt the brace position. As he fought to keep the plane coming down, Cameron was hoping that this wouldn't be needed. He would do everything he could to stop the aircraft as quickly as possible and get the passengers off. The build-up of combustible gases on board meant that a flash fire could erupt at any moment, igniting all of the air inside the cabin and spelling disaster before anybody even had a chance to escape. Finally, the DC-9 pushed over the runway threshold. The main wheels touched down, and the captain stood on the brakes and extended the spoilers fully. But the plane was barely slowing down. It had lost its anti-skid system, and the wheels now locked. Screeching along the concrete, the four main tyres burst. Then, finally, Flight 797 skidded to a halt. The pilots immediately began carrying out the emergency engine shutdown checklist, while the cabin crew sprung into action, opening the doors and shouting for the passengers to come towards the exits. Fire crews raced towards the plane, while smoke now poured out of its open exits. Once the checklists were complete, Cameron and Ouimet went back into the cabin to aid with the evacuation effort. But they only made it a few steps into the cabin before they were driven back by smoke and heat. They headed back to the cockpit and opened their windows to escape. The first officer made it out, but the captain, so exhausted by his efforts to bring the plane into land and overcome by toxic smoke, lay slumped in his seat. Ouimet directed firefighters to spray his cockpit window with foam, which brought him to and was enough to allow him to escape the burning plane through his own window. It was now 90 seconds since the evacuation had begun, and the smoke and heat had become unbearable. Barely 90 seconds after landing, 18 passengers and 5 crew members had left the airplane. Then, without warning, the cabin interior suddenly erupted into flames. Everything and everyone in its path was incinerated. 23 passengers immediately perished in the fire, most of whom were found between the midpoint of the aircraft and the cockpit. In the thick smoke, they had simply not been able to find an exit. As investigators began examining the burnt-out hull of the aircraft, they quickly discovered that the fire had not started in the onboard rubbish bin. Having discounted the most obvious ignition source, investigators then concentrated on the wiring looms that had been spliced together after the previous incident when the rear bulkhead had blown. However, they found no evidence of arcing or short-circuiting there. A breakthrough came when they listened to the cockpit voice recorder. A few seconds before the 3 circuit breakers popped, they heard electrical arcing. The investigators then focused their attention on a cable below the washroom floor. It appeared that insulation had rubbed off 2 wires, allowing them to rub together and create a short circuit. As promising a lead as this was though, there was unfortunately no way of knowing for sure if these cables were ultimately responsible for the fire. What was established though was that the fire took hold behind the washroom walls and that it had then spread between the outer fuselage and the inner walls of the cabin. Once the doors were open for the evacuation, this allowed an unlimited amount of oxygen to enter the aircraft, which directly fed the fire. But now that they knew the cause, how could investigators make sure that an accident like this would never happen again? For one thing, they recommended that washrooms must be fitted with smoke detectors. A rather obvious suggestion, but one which was not the law when this accident happened. They also recommended that floor-level lighting be installed in the aisles, which shows passengers the way to the plane's exits. If this had been in place on Flight 797, many more passengers would have been able to find their way out of the smoke-filled plane. And finally, the training around how smoke and fire are dealt with on board has changed dramatically since this accident. Now, pilots are trained to begin an emergency descent at the first sign of smoke or fire. All diagnosing about location and severity can be done on the way down. These precious few minutes may have made a crucial difference on board Flight 797. These changes, along with many others outlined in the accident's final report, have dramatically improved flight safety today. But that doesn't mean that in-flight fires are a thing of the past. Check out my video here of another more recent accident involving a fire which took hold on a Swissair flight shortly after it took off from New York. Play War Thunder for free using my links in the pinned comment and video description. It's available on PC, PlayStation, Xbox and mobile. By using my links, you'll get a massive free bonus pack if you're a new player, or if you haven't played in 6 months on PC or consoles. As part of this bonus pack, you get multiple premium vehicles, in-game currency, and more.